Batch 1. Pure voiceover script. Parts 1, 2, and Part 3 start. Nebraska Territory, October 1872. The prairie wind cut across the empty grassland like a razor blade. 17 pioneer families had staked their homestead claims along the freezing banks of the North Loup River that autumn, and every single one of them was locked in a desperate race against the clock. Winter was coming, and on the high plains of North America, winter did not merely visit. It invaded. Across the valley, the sounds of desperation echoed through the dry grass. Heavy iron axes slammed into cottonwood trunks. Timber was dragged through the dust. Log cabins were rising from the dirt, their thick walls chinked with heavy mud clay, roofs capped with split wooden shingles, and massive stone chimneys reaching eagerly toward the gray autumn sky. Every single family was building upward, reaching into the freezing sky, except one. Lars Erickson was not building up. He was digging down. While his neighbors labored under the scorching sun and bitter wind to fell trees and stack heavy timber, Erickson stood alone on a barren, south-facing hillside. He had no timber wagon. He had no wooden frame. He held nothing in his calloused hands except a simple iron spade and a worn pickaxe. Day after day, as the sun rose and set over the vast Nebraska prairie, the 17 other families watched in absolute bewilderment as Lars Erickson slowly disappeared into the side of a dirt hill. He carved away the native earth inch by inch, throwing shovelfuls of brown dirt behind him, emerging at dusk covered from head to toe in thick prairie dust. The ridicule started almost immediately. "Look at that crazy Norski," the settlers muttered to one another at dusk. "He is digging his own grave before the frost even sets in. That man has completely lost his mind." Even the local homestead children whispered in hushed, frightened tones about the madman who lived inside a hole in the earth. The seasoned frontier builders scoffed as they hauled timber, declaring that the Norwegian immigrant would be crushed alive the moment the winter ground settled. But Lars Erickson never stopped digging. What did this quiet 39-year-old Norwegian homesteader understand about radiant heat, about the thermal dynamics of Earth, and about pure human survival that 17 families of experienced American frontier settlers had completely missed? Stay with me here, because what happened when the coldest winter in a decade hit, Custer County did not just shock every homesteader on the prairie. It fundamentally broke everything they thought they knew about building a home. Before we step into the heart of this relentless storm, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what the temperature is like in your corner of the world right now. We read every single comment, and your support keeps these historic survival stories alive. Now, let's step back to the autumn of 1872 and look at the cold, hard reality facing these settlers. Lars Erickson had arrived in the Nebraska Territory in late September of 1872. He rolled onto his homestead claim with a single covered wagon, 2 working oxen, a wife named Ingrid, and 3 small children, all under the age of 7. He was 41 years old, a man of few words, with hands hardened by decades of brutal physical labor. Before immigrating to the United States, Erickson had worked in the stone quarries near Trondheim, Norway, and deep within his memory, he carried something that the American homesteaders did not possess. He remembered the gam. The gam was the traditional, semi-subterranean turf dwelling that his ancestors and the native Sami people of northern Scandinavia had built and lived in for over 1,000 years. In a land where timber was scarce and Arctic gales could rip a timber frame apart in minutes, the people of the far north had learned a timeless truth. When the air above is trying to kill you, you do not fight the wind. You retreat into the thermal mass of the earth itself. The 17 other families on the North Loup River were building what they knew best: traditional American frontier log cabins. The Henderson family was raising a solid 12 by 16-foot cabin made of heavy cottonwood logs. The Pratt family had already finished stacking their timber walls and were hard at work nailing down a tight wood plank roof. James Bradley, a 50-year-old veteran builder who had homesteaded 2 years earlier and considered himself the undisputed expert on prairie architecture, was personally supervising the construction of stone fireplaces for 3 neighboring families. These log cabin designs were classic, time-tested American structures. Log cabins had carried generations of American pioneers across the Appalachian Mountains, through the dense forests of Ohio and Missouri, and onto the sun-baked plains of Kansas. This was considered the civilized way to live. This was progress. By contrast, Erickson's approach seemed utterly primitive, if not outright suicidal. Erickson carefully surveyed the terrain of his claim until he found a specific topographical feature: a low, gently sloping hillside that faced almost directly south. The ground in front of the hill sloped downward toward a dry, seasonal creek bed, ensuring that rain and melting snow would naturally drain away from the slope. He stepped off a precise rectangle on the turf, 14 feet wide and 20 feet deep. Then he picked up his spade. He did not dig down into flat prairie earth to make a pit. Instead, he drove his pickaxe horizontally into the vertical face of the south-facing hill. He carved into the ancient prairie earth like an underground miner, throwing cubic yards of dense, dark soil behind him, creating a deep subterranean chamber that burrowed straight back into the heart of the hillside. "What in God's name is that Norski doing over there?" Sarah Henderson asked her husband on the third day of excavation as she watched Erickson labor in the dirt. "Building a root cellar, I suppose," Tom Henderson replied, leaning heavily on his double-bitted felling axe. "Though, if you ask me, it is mighty large just for storing winter turnips and salt pork." But Lars Erickson was not building a root cellar. He was engineering a family sanctuary. By the second week of October, the sheer scale of Erickson's excavation became impossible to ignore. He had carved out an underground room measuring exactly 14 feet wide, 20 feet long, and 7 feet high at the front entrance, sloping gently downward to 6 feet in height at the rear wall. To create this single room, Erickson had manually dug, lifted, and hauled out approximately 16 tons of dense prairie soil. The back wall and both side walls of the room were not timber or stone. They were raw, natural dirt, carved clean with his spade, and smoothed down until the walls looked almost polished. The front wall, which was the only side of the structure exposed to the outside winter wind, was built out of thick prairie sod blocks. Erickson cut these sod blocks directly from the low-lying grassland near the creek. Each sod block was cut roughly 12 inches wide, 18 inches long, and 4 inches thick, held together by the massive, tangled root network of native buffalo grass that had bound the Nebraska soil together for thousands of years. Erickson laid these sod blocks in a double-thick running bond pattern, stacking them like giant green bricks until the front wall reached a staggering thickness of 3 feet. The neighbors were horrified. "That man is putting his wife and tiny children inside a dirt hole like wild animals," James Bradley declared loudly one evening to a group of men gathered outside the Henderson cabin. "My grandfather did not cross the Atlantic, and my father did not clear the wilderness of Pennsylvania just so we could burrow into the mud like prairie dogs." "It is the European way," Tom Henderson offered cautiously, looking across the field at the dirt mound. "Maybe they do things differently over in Norway." "Different does not mean smart," Bradley shot back, spitting into the dry prairie grass. "Mark my words. That earth is going to saturate and collapse the very first time the ground thaws in the spring. If the cold doesn't freeze them to death this winter, that dirt roof will bury them alive." He is digging his own grave. The women of the settlement worried about practical matters. How could anyone possibly keep a dirt house clean? Wouldn't dirt fall continuously into their food and bedding? What about dampness and rot? Wouldn't a family living underground develop severe lung sickness from breathing stale, dark, damp air all winter long? Young Martha Pratt, a 19-year-old newlywed who had just moved into her husband's drafty timber cabin, actually began to cry when she saw Erickson's 3 small children playing near the dark entrance of the dugout. "Those poor sweet babies," she whispered, shaking her head. "Living in a dark hole like mole rats?" Lars Erickson heard the murmurs, but he paid them no mind. He had heard the exact same criticisms back home from younger men who thought modern timber frame houses were superior to traditional turf homes. He simply put his head down and kept working. He reinforced the inside of the 3-foot-thick front sod wall with heavy vertical support posts cut from wild cottonwood trees, sinking the post bases deep into the dirt floor. He framed a sturdy doorway using thick, salvaged oak planks he had traded for in Omaha, hanging a solid wooden door mounted on heavy leather strap hinges. Beside the door, he framed a small window opening and fitted it with 4 precious panes of real glass that he had packed in sawdust and hauled across 300 miles of rough trail. Then, Erickson did something that confused his neighbors even further. He spent 3 full days carrying heavy, flat prairie limestone rocks up from the dry creek bed. He laid these flat stones into a small, narrow fireplace built directly into the rear left corner of the underground room. The firebox itself was astonishingly small, measuring barely 18 inches across. The chimney did not go straight up through a roof. Instead, Erickson carved an angled flue through 8 solid feet of packed earth, allowing the stone pipe to emerge from the top of the hillside, 8 feet behind the front entrance. "Look at that ridiculous little stove," James Bradley scoffed as he walked past the property. "A fireplace the size of a bread box. He will freeze to death trying to heat a subterranean cave with a fire you couldn't even toast a slice of bread over." By late November, the weather shifted dramatically. The warm autumn breezes disappeared, replaced by gray, heavy clouds rolling in from the north. The 16 other families completed their wooden log cabins. They were proud, imposing structures. They had thick log walls, heavy timber roofs, high stone chimneys, and raised wooden floors set on joists above the frozen ground. The Henderson family was particularly proud of their cabin. It featured a spacious sleeping loft where their children could stay high above the cold floor. These were real American homes, built with sweat and timber, built the right way. Erickson's family quietly packed their few belongings, stepped down into their underground chamber, and shut the heavy oak door behind them. A thin, barely visible wispy trail of light gray smoke began to drift out of the tiny chimney on the hillside. At night, a soft, warm amber glow shone through the single 4-pane window set into the thick sod wall. The settlers shook their heads as they walked past the quiet dirt mound in the dark. They felt pity for the poor Norwegian family, huddled in their damp, dark grave. They had no idea that the severe winter of 1872 was about to tear their conventional world apart. What Lars Erickson had constructed on that Nebraska hillside was not a crude dirt hole. It was a masterpiece of passive thermal engineering, designed according to physical principles that Scandinavian builders had perfected over centuries of Arctic survival. While the American settlers saw only dirt, Erickson had built a structure that relied on 3 fundamental pillars of physics: thermal mass, earth-coupled insulation, and passive solar gain. Every single dimension of the dugout was chosen for a specific physical reason. The 14-foot width kept the structural span of the roof narrow enough that thick cottonwood logs could support immense weight without sagging or requiring central load-bearing pillars that would ruin the living space. The 20-foot depth pushed the back half of the dwelling deep into the core of the hillside. At a depth of 6 to 8 feet below the surface, the earth maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round. While the air temperature on the prairie surface could swing wildly from 90 degrees Fahrenheit in July to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit in January, the deep earth surrounding Erickson's dugout stayed locked at a stable baseline of roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Lars Erickson and his family were not living in an unheated cave. They were living inside a giant natural temperature regulator. The surrounding earth acted as an infinite thermal envelope, preventing the interior ambient temperature from ever dropping down to the freezing point, no matter how cold the outside air became. The 3-foot-thick sod front wall was an engineering marvel in its own right. 3 feet of dense, root-bound prairie sod provides an insulation value equivalent to an R value of roughly 20, matching 8 full inches of modern fiberglass insulation. The construction of the roof was Erickson's true engineering triumph. He laid thick cottonwood logs side by side across the 14-foot width of the dugout, spacing them just 16 inches apart from center to center. Over these structural timber logs, he laid a dense, 6-inch layer of dry prairie hay. On top of the hay, he wove a tight lattice of willow branches, followed by another thick blanket of dry grass. Finally, he covered the entire roof structure with 18 full inches of living prairie sod blocks packed tightly together with the grass side facing up. Over the next few weeks, The living grass roots in the top layer of sod began to grow together, knitting the entire roof into a single, seamless, watertight, wind-proof mass of earth that weighed approximately 8 tons. That massive 8-ton weight was not a danger. It was the structure's greatest asset. When severe prairie gales swept across the flat plains with wind speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour, conventional log cabins creaked, groaned, and leaked cold air through every tiny seam in their chinked walls. Erickson's dugout did not move an inch. The wind simply glided smoothly over the natural contour of the grass-covered hill, unable to find a single edge to catch or pull. But the most brilliant feature of Erickson's design was his heating system. The small limestone fireplace that James Bradley had mocked was situated in the rear left corner for a deliberate thermodynamic purpose. By placing the heat source at the deepest point of the dugout, Erickson forced the warm air and smoke to travel across the inner chamber before exiting through the stone chimney. Furthermore, the fireplace was built using 400 pounds of dense prairie limestone mortared directly into the earthen back wall. Limestone has a high specific heat capacity. When Erickson lit a small fire in the evening, the 400 pounds of rock and the surrounding dirt walls absorbed the intense heat of the flames. The small firebox was intentionally designed to burn hot and fast, using minimal wood. Erickson was not trying to heat the ambient air directly with open flames, like his neighbors were doing in their large open hearths. He was using a short, intense fire to charge his stone thermal battery. Once the wood burned down to embers after an hour, the stone and earth slowly radiated that stored heat back into the living room for the next 12 to 16 hours. The angled 45-degree chimney was another stroke of Scandinavian genius. As the hot exhaust gases traveled through 8 feet of stone flue, buried in the dirt hillside, the earth surrounding the chimney captured the thermal energy that would normally escape straight out into the sky. Finally, Erickson had oriented the single window directly toward the south. During the clear, crisp days of late autumn and early winter, the low winter sun sat at a shallow angle in the southern sky. Sunlight poured through the glass panes for 5 full hours every day, striking the dark earthen floor and the back wall. The dirt absorbed the solar radiation, providing free passive solar heating that added several crucial degrees of warmth to the space before night fell. In early November, James Bradley had ducked his head and stepped inside Erickson's dugout to deliver a message about a stray ox. He walked through the wooden door, glanced around the room, and shook his head with heavy contempt. "Well, Erickson, you have built yourself a fine root cellar here," Bradley said, rubbing his hand along the smooth dirt wall. "I will admit it feels dry right now, but come January, when the mercury drops below zero and stays there for a week straight, this little dirt hole is going to turn into a deep freeze. That tiny little bread box fireplace won't keep your blood from freezing solid. You will end up burning twice as much firewood as the rest of us, just trying to heat up all this cold dirt." Erickson looked at the older builder and offered a calm, humble smile. His English was limited, but he understood the doubt in Bradley's voice. "Earth not cold," Erickson said slowly, his Norwegian accent heavy and thick. "Earth stay warm, always warm." "It is dirt," Bradley shot back, tapping his boot against the earthen floor. "Dirt is cold in winter. Everyone knows that." "You will see," Erickson replied softly. Sarah Henderson visited the dugout a few days later, bringing a freshly baked loaf of rye bread for Ingrid Erickson. She had expected to step into a damp, dark, foul-smelling pit. Instead, she was stunned by what she experienced. The interior of the dugout was incredibly dry. The earthen walls were clean and smooth, stripped of all loose rocks and finished with a thin wash of lime. The floor was made of hard-packed earth, but around the beds and the small dining table, Erickson had laid clean wooden planks. To prevent any stray dust from falling from the roof poles, Ingrid had pinned clean white muslin cloth across the entire ceiling, giving the underground room a bright, cozy atmosphere. The single window let in a soft beam of golden afternoon light. It was dark compared to a house with big windows, but it was remarkably warm, still, and peaceful. "Mrs. Erickson," Sarah said, using hand gestures to communicate with Lars's wife. "Aren't you terrified that the roof will cave in on your children while you sleep?" Ingrid smiled warmly. shook her head, and pointed to the heavy cottonwood posts and the thick timber logs overhead. She patted the solid dirt wall with her hand and said a single word in English: strong. Sarah Henderson left the dugout and walked back to her family's log cabin. She looked at the solid cottonwood log walls, the heavy stone chimney that Bradley had designed, and the sturdy wooden shingle roof. She felt a deep surge of relief, thanking God that her husband had built a civilized house above ground to protect their family from the harsh winter ahead. By the end of November, all 17 homesteading families were fully prepared for winter. Massive piles of split cottonwood firewood were stacked high outside every log cabin in the settlement. Smoke billowed continuously from the chimneys as families tested their hearths and settled in for the long, cold months ahead. The Henderson cabin's large fireplace was consuming a quarter cord of wood every 3 days. It was a massive amount of labor to chop, haul, and split that much timber, but the heavy fire generated impressive heat, keeping their 12 by 16-foot room at a tolerable temperature. However, because cold air draft drifted through the tiny gaps in the log walls and the raised floor joists, the outer corners of the cabin remained cold, forcing the Henderson family to push their beds closer to the fire. Meanwhile, Lars Erickson walked into the timber stands along the creek once every few days. He returned, carrying just a small armload of dry fallen branches. Each evening, he lit a single small fire in his limestone hearth, burning perhaps 3 small logs. Within an hour, the fire would die down to glowing embers, and the chimney smoke would stop. The neighbors looked at the cold, silent chimney on the hill and whispered among themselves. "That poor fool is probably suffocating in there," Bradley told the settlers. "The air in that hole is stale and cold. He is too stubborn to build a proper fire because he doesn't have enough wood split." November turned into December. Cold rains turned into sleet, and sleet turned into heavy, wet snow. The first major cold snap of the season hit Custer County on December 18th. Overnight, the temperature plunged down to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The Henderson family woke up the next morning to find a thick layer of white frost covering the inside of their glass windows. The fire in their hearth had died down to cold ashes, and the air inside the cabin was so cold that their water bucket had frozen solid near the door. Tom Henderson spent an hour feeding split cottonwood logs into the fireplace before the cabin became warm enough for his wife and children to step out from under their heavy wool blankets. Over at the dugout, Erickson's chimney barely smoked at all that morning. "Look at that," Bradley said, pointing at the dirt mound as he walked past with his axe. "Not a lick of smoke. They are probably freezing in their beds right now, too proud to come ask for help." Directly below the ground, inside the dugout, Lars Erickson was sitting at his wooden table in his shirt sleeves, eating a warm bowl of porridge with his children. The air inside the room was quiet, dry, and comfortable. The battle between human pride and the laws of physical nature had officially begun, and winter was about to deliver its final verdict. Batch 2. Pure voiceover script. Parts 4, 5, and Part 6 start. The mild weather that had carried the homesteaders through late autumn and early December was merely an illusion. The old-timers in the region would later recall that the winter of 1872 to 1873 was only moderate by High Plains standards. But for the 17 pioneer families living along the North Loup River, the cold that arrived in the second week of January felt like the bitter end of the human world. Here's the cold, hard truth. The prairie does not give warnings. It began on the afternoon of January 9th, with a subtle, ominous shift in the wind. For days, the temperature had held steady in the mid-20s. It was cold, certainly, but manageable. The log cabin fires burned steadily. Wood supplies were slowly shrinking, but the families remained safe and warm inside their timber walls. Then, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the wind suddenly swung around to the northwest, howling down from the Arctic tundra of Canada. Within minutes, the ambient temperature began to plummet like a stone dropped down a deep well. By late afternoon on January 10th, the thermometer read 18 degrees Fahrenheit. By evening, it had fallen to 9 degrees. On the morning of January 11th, Tom Henderson stepped outside to check his thermometer at dawn. The silver mercury read 3 degrees above zero. By nightfall, it plunged straight past zero into negative territory. On the morning of January 12th, The temperature reached -8 degrees Fahrenheit. The mercury would not rise above zero for 4 solid, agonizing days. Think about that for a second. This was completely different from any weather the eastern settlers had ever experienced in their lives. In Virginia or Ohio, a cold spell meant a day or two of freezing air before the sun returned. But on the open Nebraska plains, the cold did not just visit. It occupied the territory like an invading army. It crept through every microscopic seam in every wooden wall. It turned the natural moisture of a person's breath into tiny ice crystals before the air could even leave their mouth. It froze iron tools so thoroughly that skin would instantly stick to the bare metal if touched without thick leather mittens. It killed livestock that lacked proper shelter, freezing cattle where they stood in the field, and it brutally tested every single assumption about what was warm enough to keep a human family alive. Inside the Henderson log cabin, life had devolved into a desperate battle against freeze-out. Their cabin burned through half a cord of split cottonwood in those first 3 days of sub-zero temperatures. Tom Henderson had to put on his heavy buffalo skin coat and walk out to his woodpile every 2 hours day and night, carrying massive armloads of split logs to feed the insatiable appetite of James Bradley's stone fireplace. Even with the fire roaring constantly, generating so much heat near the hearth that the wood mantle felt hot to the touch, the rest of the log cabin remained freezing cold. In the early morning hours, before the banked coals were stoked back into full flame, the interior temperature of the Henderson cabin hovered around 48 degrees Fahrenheit. By mid-afternoon, when the roaring fire was at its absolute peak, the center of the room would rise to perhaps 58 degrees. So what about the corners of the room? What about the spaces farthest from the hearth? The numbers don't lie. Those back corners dropped into the low 40s. Thick white sheets of frost formed on the inside of their glass windows every single night, freezing so hard that Sarah Henderson had to scrape the glass with a heavy kitchen knife just to let light into the room. The Henderson children stopped playing. Movement meant leaving the circle of heat near the fireplace, so they spent their entire day huddled in the center of the room under heavy wool quilts. At night, they slept together in a single bed, buried under every blanket, coat, and fur skin the family owned. Sarah Henderson wore 2 thick wool dresses and a heavy winter coat inside her own home. The log cabin provided basic survival, but comfort had completely vanished. Over at the Pratt cabin, the situation was rapidly worsening. Their timber cabin was larger, 16 feet wide by 20 feet long, which meant it had far more internal volume to heat. Their stone fireplace, built to Bradley's standard design, simply could not produce enough radiant energy to heat that much open space. Young Martha Pratt, the girl who had cried at the sight of Erickson digging his dirt hole, now spent her entire waking day sitting on a wooden stool just 3 feet from the open flames. If she stepped 5 feet back, the draft felt like ice water on her skin. The back half of their cabin, where they stored their grain sacks, flour, and dried meat, dropped well below the freezing mark. The domestic water bucket, sitting on a bench near their front door, froze solid into a block of hard ice, cracking the wooden staves. But the true hidden nightmare was their wood supply. The Pratts were burning 3/4 of a cord of wood every 4 days. That was nearly double the rate of wood consumption they had calculated when building their timber cabin in October. At this terrifying burn rate, their entire winter wood supply, which they had labored for 6 weeks to chop and split, would be completely gone by late February. If the Arctic cold persisted into March, they would face a horrifying choice: chop up their handmade wooden furniture for firewood or freeze to death in their beds. By January 14th, James Bradley was making daily rounds across the settlement, checking on families and assessing the community's dwindling wood piles. He was burning through his own timber stockpile at an alarming rate, and he could see the rising tide of panic in his neighbors' eyes. Several families were already rationing their fires, allowing the hearth to die down completely at night to save wood, then rebuilding massive fires in the morning. It was a miserable, dangerous compromise between bitter cold and absolute desperation. Bradley visited 11 families that week. Every single cabin told the accurate, unvarnished story of frontier failure: struggling fireplaces, freezing corners, dry cracked hands, ice on the inside walls, shrinking wood piles, and a deep, silent terror of what would happen if the cold snap stretched into February. He did not visit Lars Erickson's dugout. He didn't think he needed to. He could see from 200 yards away that something was unnaturally quiet about that dirt mound on the hillside. The tiny limestone chimney on the hill barely smoked at all. Once a day, for perhaps 1 hour in the early evening, a thin trail of gray smoke would rise into the frozen blue sky. Then, it would stop completely. For the remaining 23 hours of the day, there was absolute silence. No roaring fires, no massive stacks of wood being lugged across the snow, no constant chopping, no continuous billows of black wood smoke. He is either dead or his family is dying inside that hole, Bradley told the Henderson family on the evening of January 15th. He had walked over to borrow an iron-splitting wedge. His own heavy wedge had shattered in the extreme cold and found the Hendersons gathered tight around their roaring hearth, feeding log after log into the flames. No human family can survive -8 degrees with one tiny fire a day, Bradley declared, stomping his boots against the floor to restore circulation to his toes. Nobody. Maybe he is burning fuel at night, when we can't see the smoke, Tom Henderson offered, looking out the frost-covered window. I have watched that dirt mound for 3 straight days, Bradley insisted, his voice hardening. One fire. Evening only. Either that Norski is the toughest man in the Nebraska Territory, or he and his family are frozen stiff inside that grave, too stubborn to come out and admit defeat. Sarah Henderson, looking at her shivering children, said softly, Tom, maybe we should walk over there tomorrow. Bring them some warm soup. See if they need help hauling wood. Bradley scoffed loudly. If that fool wanted to prove he was smarter than the rest of the territory, let him prove it. When he comes crawling out on his knees begging for shelter, then we will know the cold, hard truth. Now, picture this. Lars Erickson did not come crawling out. On the morning of January 16th, Tom Henderson's overwhelming curiosity finally defeated his pioneer pride. The ambient air temperature had remained below 0 for 5 straight days. His own family had burned through wood faster than he could physically split it. His hands were raw, and his wife's fingers were cracked and bleeding from the bone-dry cold air inside their log cabin. And yet, that Norwegian's chimney still only smoked for 1 single hour each evening. It violated every rule of common sense. If a timber cabin with a 6-foot fireplace was freezing at 48 degrees inside, how could a dirt hole with an 18-inch firebox be anything other than a frozen tomb? Tom Henderson pulled on his heavy wool coat, wrapped his face in a thick scarf, and began the quarter-mile trek to the Erickson homestead at 10 o'clock in the morning. The thermometer read -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The prairie wind was calm, but the air was so dense with frost that his breath formed floating clouds of ice crystals behind him. Every single step across the frozen grass sounded like stepping on crushed glass. As he approached the dugout, Henderson noticed something that made him stop dead in his tracks. There was no frost on Erickson's window. The glass pane set into the thick sod wall was completely clear. Inside the Henderson cabin, the glass was covered in a 1/4 inch of solid ice. But here, on this dirt wall, the glass was entirely transparent, shining brightly in the winter sun. Henderson walked up to the heavy oak door and knocked. Seconds later, the door swung open. And what happened next completely shattered Tom Henderson's reality. A wave of warm, soft air rushed out of the doorway, hitting Henderson's frozen face like a physical touch. Lars Erickson stood in the open doorway, wearing only a cottonwork shirt and canvas trousers. No coat, no heavy wool sweater, no multiple layers of clothing. Behind him, inside the room, Ingrid Erickson was sitting at a wooden table, quietly sewing a shirt. The 3 small children were playing on the wooden floorboards in their bare feet. No one was huddled near the hearth. In fact, the limestone fireplace was completely cold. Not a single spark was burning in the grate. "Mr. Henderson," Erickson said, offering a wide, genuine smile. Come in, come in. It is cold outside." Tom Henderson stepped across the threshold and froze. The temperature difference was so extreme, so immediate, that Henderson thought for a second his frozen face was tricking his brain. But this was real heat. It was not the harsh, scorching heat of a roaring log fire that burned your face while your back stayed cold. It was a deep, even surrounding warmth that felt like an autumn afternoon. "Good God," Henderson whispered, pulling off his heavy scarf. "How warm is it in here?" Erickson did not speak fluent English, but he understood the question perfectly. He walked over to the dirt wall and pointed to a small glass thermometer hanging on a brass peg, one of the few store-bought items in the entire dwelling. The red mercury line read exactly 62 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. Outside, the prairie air was 4 degrees below zero. Inside the log cabins across the valley, families were shivering at 48 degrees while burning a quarter cord of wood a day. Inside Lars Erickson's dugout, the room was a comfortable 62 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire had been completely out for 12 hours, and the air was dry, still, and warm. "How?" Henderson asked, his voice shaking with a mix of awe and sheer disbelief. "How is this possible? Stay with me here," because what Tom Henderson was standing inside was not magic. It was pure, unadulterated physics. Erickson took Henderson by the arm, led him to the back of the room, and placed the American settler's bare hand flat against the unpainted dirt wall. Henderson braced himself, expecting the dirt to feel cold, damp, and slimy. Instead, the dirt felt warm. Not hot, but comfortably, solidly warm to the touch. "Earth," Erickson said, gesturing to the back wall, the side walls, and the ceiling overhead. "Earth hold heat. Always hold heat." He led Henderson over to the limestone fireplace in the corner. The 400 pounds of prairie stone were still warm, slowly radiating thermal energy into the room, even though the last wood log had burned to ash the previous night. Erickson had burned just 3 small cottonwood logs the evening before, roughly 1/8 of the wood the Hendersons burned every single day. That brief, high-temperature flame had charged the 400 pounds of stone and the solid earthen walls behind it. Now, hours later, that stored thermal energy was slowly, steadily releasing back into the living space. Then Erickson pointed toward the south-facing window. Even on a brutal -4-degree January morning, the low winter sun shone directly through the glass panes for 5 hours, striking the dark earthen floor and the back wall. The dirt absorbed every single ray of passive solar energy, storing it in the soil. The dugout was not a weak fire fighting an overwhelming Arctic wind. It was an integrated, self-regulating thermal engine. The surrounding ground provided a constant baseline temperature of 50 degrees Fahrenheit that never dropped, no matter how cold the sky became. The stone fireplace and the solar window added just 12 degrees of supplementary heat to bring the room to 62 degrees. And the 16 tons of earth overhead acted as an invincible thermal battery that locked the heat inside. Tom Henderson stood in the middle of that 14 by 20-foot space and felt a profound sense of humility wash over him. Everything he had been taught about civilized living was wrong. He had believed that building a proper home meant building above ground, using timber, and maintaining a massive open fire. Yet his proud timber cabin was burning through 4 cords of wood a fortnight just to keep his children shivering at 48 degrees, while this Norwegian man, whom everyone had mocked as a madman, was relaxing comfortably at 62 degrees using 1/8 of the fuel. "How much wood do you burn?" Henderson asked, holding up his fingers to mime the question. "In a week?" Erickson held up one hand, spreading 5 fingers wide. 5 days, Erickson said, pointing to a tiny pile of split sticks sitting beside the cold hearth. That small pile, which Henderson's fireplace would consume in 3 hours, was Erickson's fuel supply for 5 full days. Henderson felt his chest tighten, not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization of his own arrogance. They had all laughed at this man. They had called him a crazy foreigner, a fool digging his own grave. And all the while, Lars Erickson had been living in absolute comfort, safety, and warmth. "I need to bring the others," Henderson said softly. "They have to see this with their own eyes." By 6 o'clock that evening, 7 pioneer men had walked across the snow to visit the Erickson dugout. James Bradley came last. He walked reluctantly, his boots crunching in the frozen snow, after watching his neighbors return from the dirt mound with expressions of absolute wonder and quiet shame. Bradley stepped through the door, pulled off his heavy hat, and stood silently in the warm air of that underground sanctuary for 10 straight minutes. His technical mind, which had built dozens of log cabins across 3 states, was desperately trying to calculate what he was witnessing. It shouldn't work, Bradley finally muttered to himself, running his hand along the dry, warm dirt wall. The earth should draw out the heat. The small fireplace should be completely inadequate. And yet, the cold, hard proof surrounded him. 3 children playing in their shirt sleeves. A clear window with 0 frost. A baseline room temperature 14 degrees warmer than the finest log cabin in the entire settlement, achieved with a tiny fraction of the wood. "How did you know?" Bradley asked, looking directly at Erickson. Erickson offered his gentle, humble smile. He spoke for several minutes in Norwegian, using his hands to demonstrate the shape of the earth, the path of the sun, and the thick turf dwellings of his ancestors in Norway. Though Bradley could not translate the Norwegian words, the physical meaning was crystal clear. "My people have lived this way for 1,000 years. We learned long ago that you do not fight the extreme cold of winter with brute force. You use the earth as your blanket. You work with nature, not against it." Bradley turned without saying another word, opened the door, and walked back out into the -14-degree winter night. He walked into his own log cabin, a fine, proud, traditional American home, and threw another heavy armload of cottonwood onto his roaring fire. The room temperature inside his cabin was 51 degrees Fahrenheit. His family sat shivering by the hearth. That night, the cold snap reached its absolute climax. The ambient temperature outside dropped to a brutal -14 degrees Fahrenheit. The Henderson family burned an entire cord of wood in 48 hours just to keep their cabin above 45 degrees. Young Martha Pratt wept in her bed, terrified that their wood stack would run out before the freeze broke. And inside the dirt dugout on the hillside, Lars Erickson burned his small evening fire, 3 logs. 1 hour of flame banked his coals and went to sleep beside his family. The 400 pounds of limestone radiated steady heat throughout the night. The earth held them warm. The difference in temperature between the coldest log cabin and the Erickson dugout that night was 42 degrees Fahrenheit. 42 degrees that separated absolute misery from complete comfort, survival panic from quiet peace. The brutal cold snap finally broke on January 21st. The temperature climbed back above 0, then into the teens, and by the end of the month, warm breezes brought mild 30s back to the Nebraska prairie. The crisis had passed, but the lesson had been permanently carved into the minds of the 17 homesteading families. On January 28th, during a Sunday gathering at the Pratt cabin, Tom Henderson stood up in front of the entire settlement. "I have something I need to say to everyone here," Henderson began, holding a tin cup of hot coffee in his calloused hands. "For 3 months, we have all been calling Lars Erickson a fool. I was the loudest voice in this valley, saying he made a terrible mistake digging that hole in the hill. I want to publicly apologize to Lars for my own ignorance." A deep silence fell over the room. Admitting mistake was not something pioneer men did lightly. "During that cold snap, my family burned 4 cords of wood in 2 weeks," Henderson continued, looking around the room. "We maintained temperatures between 45 and 55 degrees, and we nearly froze doing it. Lars Erickson burned less than 1 cord of wood in the same period, and his home stayed above 60 degrees every single day. That is not luck. That is not magic. That is superior engineering." James Bradley, sitting silently in the corner, nodded his head slowly. "It is thermal mass," Bradley declared softly, his tone transformed from arrogance to deep scientific respect. "The man built a thermal battery. The Earth 6 feet down stays at 50 degrees year-round. He didn't build a house that fights the cold air. He built a house that sits inside the Earth's natural warmth, then adds just enough heat to make it comfortable." Sarah Henderson spoke next. "And it is clean. I thought living in dirt would be filthy and damp, but their home is drier than ours. The earth breathes, managing humidity naturally, without any condensation on the walls." By the end of that afternoon, 5 homesteading families asked Lars Erickson if he would help them locate suitable hillsides on their own claims to build subterranean homes for the following winter. James Bradley, setting aside his professional pride entirely, spent 3 days taking meticulous measurements of Erickson's dugout, documenting the roof pitch, the sod stacking patterns, the stone chimney angles, and the south-facing solar placement, creating standardized building plans for the entire settlement to use. Batch 3. Pure voiceover script. Part 6 Conclusion, Part 7 Philosophy and Disclaimer. By late 1873, 17 months after Lars Erickson had first set foot on his claim and driven his pickaxe into that south-facing hill, 11 new earth-sheltered structures had been constructed within a 50-mile radius of the North Loup settlement. Not all of them were full dugouts. Some settlers built sod houses with thick prairie earth bermed high against 3 outer walls. Others excavated partially subterranean foundations, digging 4 feet into hillsides while framing low wood plank roofs covered in sod. Each builder adapted the core Scandinavian design to their specific location and family size. But every single one of them relied on the exact same physical principle that Lars Erickson had brought from Trondheim. Stop fighting against nature and start utilizing the thermal stability of the earth beneath your feet. The real-world results across the entire region were astonishing. The earth-sheltered homes in Custer County consumed 60 to 70% less firewood throughout the harsh winter than the conventional timber frame cabins. They held higher average interior temperatures during extreme cold snaps, maintained natural humidity without interior wall frost, and stood completely unfazed by 50-mile-per-hour prairie winds that regularly blew split wooden roof shingles off standard homes. In 1886, the United States Department of Agriculture published an official bulletin on prairie homesteading methods. The report included a detailed section on earth-sheltered construction. The official government text observed that while such subterranean dwellings might appear crude or unusual to builders accustomed to timber framing, practical experience on the western frontier had conclusively proven their unmatched thermal efficiency, structural safety, and fuel conservation in regions subject to severe temperature extremes. Even official history had to yield to physical evidence. Lars Erickson lived comfortably in his original hillside dugout with his wife and children for 11 full years. In 1883, having fully proven his homestead claim and accumulated financial stability through successful farming, he built a large, conventional timber frame farmhouse on the property. It had high ceilings, white-painted siding, and large glass windows, the kind of home his neighbors had built a decade earlier. Yet, family records show that Erickson never destroyed his original dugout. He converted the underground room into a workshop, a root cellar, and according to accounts written by his grandchildren, a warm family retreat during the most severe winter blizzards. Even with a modern 2-story wood house available, Erickson understood that his original earth-sheltered structure remained the warmest, safest, and most energy-efficient shelter on his entire farm. Lars Erickson passed away peacefully in 1891 at the age of 60. He was laid to rest in a small prairie cemetery overlooking the North Loup River Valley. The stone headstone placed over his grave by his children carries a simple, understated inscription carved into the granite. He built well. It was a quiet, modest epitaph for an immigrant who had quietly revolutionized how an entire territory thought about winter survival, architectural engineering, and human shelter. Erickson never sought fame. He wrote no technical manuals. He made no public speeches. He simply stood on a windy hill in 1872, trusted the ancient wisdom of his ancestors, built a home that worked, and calmly endured the laughter of his neighbors until the cold, hard truth of winter proved him right. The broader lesson of Lars Erickson's dugout extends far beyond 19th-century frontier history. It speaks to the dangerous human habit of confusing the traditional with the primitive. It exposes our instinct to assume that modern methods are automatically superior to ancient techniques, and it warns us against mocking knowledge systems we do not yet understand, simply because they look unfamiliar to our eyes. The American settlers who built conventional log cabins along the North Loup River were not foolish people. They were brave, tough, hard-working pioneers, carrying generations of timber-building experience from the eastern forests. However, that timber knowledge had geographical boundaries. When transplanted onto the treeless, windswept, sub-zero high plains of North America, traditional methods proved wildly inefficient. Lars Erickson brought a different tradition, one forged over 1,000 years in the brutal, treeless tundra of northern Europe. His genius was not that he invented something new. His genius lay in his humility. He possessed the quiet wisdom to listen to the land, respect the laws of thermodynamics, and trust the experience of those who came before him. In our modern world, we frequently fall into the exact same trap. We celebrate high-tech, energy-intensive solutions while dismissing low-tech, time-tested traditional knowledge as obsolete relics of the past. Yet, as energy costs soar and grid reliability comes under pressure, architects and off-grid builders across the globe are turning their attention back to the exact same principles Lars Erickson used: earth berming, thermal mass storage, passive solar orientation, and soil-coupled insulation. Sometimes, the best solution to a modern crisis is not the newest invention. Sometimes, it is the oldest lesson, waiting patiently in the earth to be remembered by those humble enough to learn. Thank you for listening to this story of historic frontier survival. If this story changed how you think about traditional engineering, hit that subscribe button, like the video, and leave a comment sharing what traditional survival technique from your heritage you think modern society needs to bring back today. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current building codes and safety guidelines,